Thanks for listening to the Farmers Weekly podcast. Do remember you can subscribe to Farmers Weekly magazine and get all the latest news, views and market prices by visiting fwi.co.uk. Welcome to the Farmers Weekly podcast. I'm your host, Johann Tasker, the first Farmers Weekly podcast of the year, recorded on Friday the 3rd of January 2025. A happy new year to one and all. In this episode, we're going to be taking a special look at the year ahead and what the next 12 months might hold for growers and livestock producers. We're going to do that with three special guests, all experts in their respective fields, as it were, looking at food production, agriculture, ways to generate income from the farmed environment, and also a special look at government policy. Lots of crystal ball gazing then, predictions and forecasts with maybe a little educated guesswork thrown in for good measure. The first big event of the year, though, will be a keynote speech by Defra Secretary Steve Reed to the Oxford Farming Conference on Thursday the 9th of January. The Oxford Farming Conference has a reputation for setting the tone for the farming year and is chaired this year by Worcestershire farmer Jeff Sansom, who's also the former head of agriculture at Natural England. And Jeff joins us now. Jeff, it's been a tough few months for farmers given the autumn budget and the government's decision to impose inheritance tax on farmers. We've seen protests in London and across the country, tractors taking to the streets, farmers taking to the streets too. Fair play to Defra Secretary Steve Reed, some might say, for coming to Oxford and fronting up to the industry. He's certainly got some explaining to do, but what sort of reception do you think he'll get?
I think you summed it up really. Fair play to him. Steve stood up at the conference last year when he was Shadow Minister, and essentially he said, vote Labour, we'll give you your farming future back. Those words will possibly come to haunt him a little bit, because obviously there's a certain proportion of farmers who think their future may have been stolen from them at the moment. So it's inevitable that the budget issues will arise, but I really don't want them to dominate Steve's session. I'm not sure what he's going to talk about. We're not cited on it. I'm sure he'll mention the future food strategy, the kind of Newton Labour New Deal for farmers. And it's quite traditional that there's usually some kind of policy announcement from the Secretary of State at the OFC. Interestingly, the last 2 years, that has been an increase in the payment rates for countryside stewardship. But given where we are at the moment, I'm pretty sure that won't be on his agenda this year.
Yeah, lots of budgetary pressures. The industry faces huge changes. The Oxford Farming Conference, Jeff, it always has a theme, and this year's theme is indeed facing change, finding opportunity. How did that theme come about?
Yeah, sure. It's a theme we settled on 14 months ago, and we always like to announce the theme at the end of the conference. And it was obvious, as ever, really, the industry is facing change. And I don't think we were I don't think we were expecting quite so much change as we've had. And the word change became a bit of a political slogan during the year. But I and the directors, we're just very keen to take the long view that this industry has responded to change over decades and always finds the opportunity. And really, the Oxford Farming Conference is very much about showcasing opportunity. Our strapline is include, challenge and inspire. So I'm hoping and pretty certain that we're going to get some very inspiring talks which will rev people up to go away and, see how they can address these multiple changes and take advantage of them.
And you farm yourself. How is change affecting your farm business, and what are you doing to seize the opportunities from change?
Yeah, well, like many farming businesses, we've changed dramatically over the years. And when I say over the years, I can look back a good 150 years and see how we've changed from dairying to intensive field vegetable production to essentially now what is extensive beef production, direct sales, and quite a bit of environmental stewardship wrapped around that as well.
You're also doing some cider, is that right? Did I see on social media?
Yeah, absolutely. It's it was always a long-term plan of mine. We replanted an orchard, which was there way back in late Victorian times, and took a first crop of cider from that last year went exceptionally well. So we're up in production. We're the first farm outside Worcester. We already have a pretty good customer base for our direct beef sales, and we could have sold probably 5 times the amount of cider last year than we had. So yeah, that's increasing, and it's an interesting sector to be part of, Johann.
You have, of course, Jeff, changed yourself, standing down recently as head of agriculture at Natural England.
As young as I look, Johann, I did 42 years as a public civil servant, starting with ADAS, Rural Development Service, Natural England. So, let's say, like agriculture, I've transitioned into the next stage of my career, which is back on the home farm.
And are you missing it? Are you missing your time being at Natural England, or how's that working out?
Yeah, of course, I miss it. It was a big part of my life, and I was interacting with, some superb people in the industry and having a part to play in shaping some of the policies. It's fascinating to look back, even the last 20 years, quite honestly, because it was a time when, entry-level stewardship was launched and was immensely successful. High-level stewardship was launched, again, immensely successful. Then we've had, budget reductions, new schemes introduced, the whole agriculture transition, the decline of BPS, all of that was immensely challenging, but again, created opportunities. And bringing us back to the conference, I think now we've got a coalition of issues, which makes it, pretty challenging for farmers. We've got clearly the last stages of transition away from BPS. We've got, shall we say, slightly faltering messages around environmental land management at the moment, and the ongoing, productivity issues and challenges. If you put all of that together, plus the budget issues, then I can see that many farmers will be having their confidence pretty well knocked. And I'm hoping that conferences like this just gives people, the confidence to reset their sights, take a longer term view. It's pretty important that we don't get absolutely sidetracked by, these what are hopefully short-term issues. There's still immense gains to be had in farming productivity. And one of the afternoon sessions, we'll be looking at, innovations in plant breeding for sustainable development by Dr. Bram Govertz. And indeed, quite a controversial topic, we'll be looking at innovation in genetic selection by Craig Lewis. So there are some great opportunities for the industry, and it's pretty important that we don't talk ourselves down and get drawn down by what are some really important but hopefully short-term issues which we will come through.
And we'll be looking at some of those short-term issues and indeed longer-term issues affecting agriculture in this episode of the Farmers Weekly podcast. It's not, though, Jeff, just about the government when it comes to policy at Oxford. You've got a broad spectrum of politicians attending.
The big session is the opening session, Johann, which is essentially the politics and business session. And probably for the first time for a very, very long time, we've got all of the ministers from the devolved nations. So that's a pretty mega political session. And it's going to be very interesting to see what comes up in the question time and how those respond. And I do hope there's going to be some inspiration in there. Possibly following that is the one I'm really looking forward to, is when we've got Phil Jarvis from Alban Wise and Neil Hesseltine from Hilltop Farm, two very, very different farming businesses. But basically, they're going to be saying, OK, based on what you've just heard, this is how we are responding to the current policies of the day, very much from a positive perspective in terms of how they are shaping their business to take advantage of the opportunities that they see. And closing that session, because we don't want to be too insular, we have a lady called Lisbeth Henriksen from Seegers Innovation in Denmark, who's going to begin giving us the Danish perspective, obviously a teeny country with a massive agricultural production, superb cooperation, but doing some really groundbreaking things in terms of carbon taxes, in terms of addressing some of their environmental issues. So I think those three presentations together are going to be pretty fascinating in terms of how we respond to the changes of the day.
And a message for our political leaders from the chairman of the Oxford Farming Conference. Jeff, what would you say?
What would I say to politicians at the moment? I love statistics, Johann, and you can't get away from the fact that in England, round about 102,000 farmers manage 71% of their land. That's an incredible statistic. And the land isn't only for food production, it's there for public enjoyment, it's there to deliver clean air, clean water, biodiversity. And the government has to be able to work with the people who manage that land. Clearly, they've got some tough choices, some tough issues around budget, but there needs to be a relationship between government and the farmers. And clearly, that's a little bit fragile at the moment. And I'm hoping and trusting that over the course of the next months, hopefully not years, that relationship will improve and get more stable, so we can collectively address the real challenges that farmers have the solution to.
A good message to hear, a good message to give. Jeff Sanson, Chairman of the Oxford Farming Conference and Worcestershire farmer, thank you very much. Now, the Oxford Farming Conference is totally sold out with a waiting list, but digital tickets are still available at £75 each. So if you want to join in the fun online, have a listen, take part, you can do so by visiting ofc.org.uk.
Revolutionise your livestock farming with Avent. Handle feed, bedding and manure with ease thanks to our compact loaders. With a vast range of attachments, Avent makes every task quicker and simpler. Enhance your farm's productivity. Search for Avent now.
The Farmers Weekly Podcast.
You're listening to the Farmers Weekly podcast. I'm Johann Tasker with a preview of what 2025 will mean for farming. We've heard about Defra Secretary Steve Reed fronting up to farmers at this month's Oxford Farming Conference, and we're joined now by Norfolk farmer and farm foresight analyst Emily Norton, an independent strategic advisor for the rural sector. Emily, a long-standing Westminster watcher, you work with farmers, investors and politicians to make sense of farming's future. If we look at government policy, we've seen the farm protests over the inheritance tax decision. We've seen farm leader, NFU President Tom Bradshaw in and out of Downing Street before Christmas. We've seen him give evidence to the House of Commons Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Committee on the challenges facing farming, not least because of the autumn budget. Where are we now in terms of the industry's relationship with what is still a fairly new Labour government?
Yeah, fairly new Labour government finding its feet, and perhaps can't have expected the pushback that happened towards the latter half of last year with the announcements that were made in the budget. So I think it needs to get its confidence back and feel that it can make good decisions for farming, because farming really needs some good leadership at the moment.
Do you think Labour gets farming? I mean, we've had the furore and the fallout from the autumn budget, the inheritance tax announcement. Do they get farming?
Look, I think one of my concerns is that farming doesn't get itself at the moment. And it's just a slightly odd thing to say, but I was listening to what Tom Bradshaw was saying at the Defra committee in mid-December around how he felt that the covenant between farming and government, and he said that farming gets on and does its job of producing food, and it's never really been about the returns. I think that sort of just misunderstands farming in general, and I'm quite worried that our farming leaders at the moment don't really understand how farming is changing and our need to kind of be there for society and actually reflect the needs of society, which are much, much, much broader than just producing food. And so, does Labour understand farming? I think it really depends on kind of who it's speaking to, but farming needs to understand that it needs to be delivering much, much more than it has done before. And so updating this entire setting is part of the challenge.
Expand on that point then. Let's start with what farming has to do first and then move on to what we can expect from the government. What do you mean by that? What does farming have to do in 2025?
I think there's this bigger understanding now that we're delivering against much broader targets than simply this idea that we're all about food, right? We haven't been all about food ever since we had the shift from production-based subsidies to area-based payments under the Common Agricultural Policy. And everything that's happened since then has said, look, we get it. We know we need to produce food, but we also need to do all of these other things. And if we think about the full range of things that the land provides for us, whether it's nature or water or access and recreation, we've got to be doing all of this from the land, not just one thing. And so it's complicated. I get it's complicated and that it's much easier and much simpler if you just go, no, we're all about producing food. But I think it's not that. And the future of farming needs to be much more integrated and much more blended. And it's much more interesting as well to be thinking about all of these different things, because that's what society, in its broadest sense, needs farming to be delivering.
And to deliver, we do need that policy framework. So what can we expect from the Labour government this year?
Really good question. We've got a lot to think about in the next 12 months, and reading kind of the little bits of information, little nuggets of wording that Labour are putting into their policy statements. I think we are going to have to think about three big things. So the first is Labour doubling down on net zero. It's one of its 5 key missions. And if we kind of hope that this sort of crazy kind of accounting stuff and the pressure that farming is being put under is going to go away, I think Labour's messaging is that that's not true. The Net Zero Council was relaunched just before Christmas, and there are all of these obvious consequences for land use and for farming systems. We think back to kind of that big pushback on technology adoption that we got just before Christmas with Beauvais. But we need to have the evidence that other things are just as effective if we don't want technology. And we can't manage what we can't measure. And my problem with all of this is that gut feeling is just not good enough for the corporate disclosure requirements. And we're going to end up losing market share to other countries who do get this. And the EU is really pushing on this too. And think about what's happening in Denmark and its carbon tax. So how we manage this whole piece on net zero for farming is really important. If we want it to be more complicated and not just about net zero, how are we communicating those other values? And I'm working with a business called Soil Association Exchange, which is trying to do that and keep it simple. But my problem is, where are these baked in as legal targets? Net zero is, but our understanding of how we use the land, and not just farming, but the land in general, the pressures there. So I think net zero is one big thing that we need to be thinking about in the year ahead.
You said there were 3 things, Emily. The second one?
The second one is the environment, a really loose term, but the environment in the context of the spending review and Treasury thinking specifically. So last July, Steve Reed, he announced a rapid review of the Environmental Improvement Plan targets and how they're aligning then with the spend that Defra is held accountable to. It's pretty hard to see in a lot of places at the moment what the link between, say, environmental options under SFI, for example, and the Environmental Improvement Plan goals are. But it's much worse for things like water quality than it is perhaps, say, soil management. And then the third aspect, so doubling down on net zero, kind of environment and aligning that with spend and regulation. And this third one is around food security. Labour were the party that were big on commitment to this. I think that what they announced just before Christmas, again, in terms of kind of getting to a new perspective on food security, and launching this review, Henry Dimbleby did all that, but I think they want to go back and kind of look at this. And so what we're saying into that space, what we as farming are saying into that space about food security, I think is really important. It is about returns. Farming's got to be profitable. And that's why, again, I was kind of worried about what Tom Bradshaw was saying at the Defra committee, saying, we're producing food, but it's not really been about the returns, and he's saying it's about the way of life and the heritage and the custodianship. I'm kind of calling that out, I think, because it doesn't speak for the tenanted sector who have to pay rent. It doesn't speak to the professional farming sector who have to pay staff, and everybody has to reinvest in the system. And so we're sort of trapping ourselves in this kind of mindset of poverty, and we really need to break out of that if we're going to make a coherent argument that supply chains need to be fair and farmers need to be fairly rewarded as an industry for what we're doing, and kind of thinking about all of those elements of what food security genuinely means, which is that the biggest risk to food security identified in last year's food security report was sort of erosion of natural capital, and the fact that we haven't got the nature there to support the food production and the everything else that we need to do in order to kind of make our entire system healthy and resilient. So we've got to kind of cut through some of the noise around food security and its slightly backward looking bit to say, look, let's lean into this review and really think about what a progressive, positive, enabled system looks like that's meeting the needs of society. So there are questions more than kind of specific outcomes, Johann, and there's kind of lots of sort of nuances within all of them. But I think those three things and how they're going to influence what's coming forwards in terms of the sort of the specifics of SFI, for example, but also the specifics of things like the neonics announcement is really important.
And the theme of the Oxford Farming Conference, facing change, finding opportunity, you really do believe then that there are opportunities to be had in 2025 for farming, for farmers, food producers, because we seem to be at loggerheads with the government as an industry at the minute.
Well, again, there's this idea that we're one industry, but actually we're not doing enough to celebrate the diversity of the industry and the differences of approach and how that brings resilience. And so I think this idea that it's at loggerheads, it's not been at loggerheads. I think there's been a sector, a portion, a subset of the industry that's really picked a fight on this. But I think there's a lot of people who kind of get that we need to be thinking about society differently. We need to be thinking about what we're producing, what we're contributing from farms differently in order to continue to kind of be positive and not to fall into this trap of feeling like we're the victims of all of this stuff. Like, how do we break that victim mindset and start saying, here are the positive stories, here are the positive examples, these are the tools that we need in order to enable this net zero transition, in order to enable nature recovery, and do all of that whilst enabling sort of the food and the resources and the energy and the nature and everything else that we need to be provided from the land. And so I think it's a mindset shift, but unless we adopt that mindset shift, we're going to alienate ourselves and push ourselves backwards. And so I'm really hoping that as many positive examples of opportunity can be found here and that we get loads of positivity at the Oxford Farming Conference. I'm really looking forward to going.
Yeah, all roads lead to Oxford in January. Emily Norton, Farm Foresight Analyst, thank you very much.
The Farmers Weekly Podcast.
You're listening to the Farmers Weekly Podcast with me, Johann Tasker. Lots of opportunity over the coming year then when it comes to farm policy and ensuring that policy is fit for purpose. For most farmers, though, the primary purpose of farming is to produce food. So what are the prospects for profitable food production during 2025? We're joined on the line now by Anderson's farm business consultant, Graham Redman, editor of the John Nicks Farm Management Pocketbook. Graham, the business costings, the farm costings in the 2025 pocketbook, are we all going to be profitable farmers this year?
That's a big question to start with. It will obviously vary from one farm to the next, but at the moment things are looking reasonable. Early to tell at this stage because anything can happen in the commodity market, as we all know so well. It'd be easy for me to say it's going to be a great year or a disastrous year, and then things suddenly change. But as it stands at the moment, obviously we've got the crop in the ground. So for the arable farmers, a better start than last year, for example. So things are looking far more positive because they've got something to grow and look after. The markets they've been really, really quite steady, haven't they? So how that's going to move over the next 12 months, obviously we can't tell. But then the other part is of course, the costs. And there's been a lot of inflation in agriculture in the last couple of years. Some of those costs come back down again. So the variable costs, they go up and then they come back down. They fluctuate almost as wildly as the fluctuation in costs of the commodities that we sell. But other costs don't, and they're more sticky, aren't they? Like the overheads, machinery, labour, the costs of occupying land tend to be stickier. And they're the ones that are, stubbornly high. And once they're built into a farm business, they're very difficult to get out. So there's a big challenge for a lot of farmers to really concentrate on trimming those as best they can. And then I think one or two of your other contributors have been talking about policy. Obviously, that's changing. And it's really going to impact the farmer this year. We're really going to notice the loss of basic payment and the introduction of the environmental schemes, and how well we as an industry and farmers as individuals can harness value out of that, as well as environmental improvement.
We're going to talk about environmental schemes in a minute, but in terms of food production costs and commodity prices, they do seem to be coming back into balance, at least in some sectors. I know things like dairy, for example, they have been volatile.
Dairy farming, yes, indeed. The milk price is actually at the moment more volatile than most other commodities that come out of agriculture. So, yes, they had an exceptionally good year, didn't they, a couple of years ago. Last year, not so much, quite a fall in the fortunes from the dairy sector. But as it looks at the moment, things have picked up for the 24-25 year. So we've got 3 months left of that year to go, and the price is picking up. And generally speaking, over the long term, the dairy sector is probably the most profitable sector in agriculture in the UK. It might seem surprising to a lot of people listening to that, but over the sort of the industry as a whole, there is a greater return, particularly, of course, specifically from agriculture. So a lot of other sectors, they make their money from non-farming activities, whereas the dairy sector, a lot of farming takes place on every hectare on a dairy farm. Tends to have more sort of fundamental profitability underlying the business in those cases. And so as we go into 2025, and milk price is picking up, and if those dairy farmers can really keep those costs under control, maximise the amount of milk they can get from grass, they should be in for a better year this coming year than last year.
One of the things that stood out for me in the 2025 Farm Management Pocketbook, Graham, was that you're saying that food production, well, farmers may be better off looking at things other than food production.
So farmers, yeah, you're absolutely right. Farm or land occupants have got more choice now with what to do with their land. That's the positive way of looking at it in terms of Defra is now a customer. They will pay farmers for doing things with their land. And in some cases, it's quite a good opportunity. Some of the returns are good. It's not necessarily the case on every farm or on every piece of land. And so farmers need to look at these environmental options as other enterprises, as gross margins, and work out the overall profitability. Does it work for the farm? Does it work for that particular piece of land? What are the options which fit into my farm system? And therefore, how can I make a margin out of it? And also, deliver the requirements that Defra has asked for in terms of, environmental gain and land use change. So, yes, there are some farms that will be switching. I don't think it's going to be huge. There's not going to be a massive swing away from food production into an environmental use, but it'd be quite useful.
And in terms of food production on a national or an international level, can we still compete with imports coming into the country? Can we still compete in that global market? Or should we be looking more at niche value-added products rather than commodities?
The answer to that question, Johann, is yes on both counts. Yes, we can compete. If we couldn't compete internationally with commodities, we just wouldn't have an agricultural industry. So, yes, we have some very, very good farmers in the UK. We have an exceptional industry. We have a robust supply chain. We have the support mechanisms in place. So, yes, it's a mature industry that works well. Margins, though, fundamentally in the commodity sector are tight. That is what defines commodity agriculture. So it's a different kind of business model to something which is added value. At the same time, some farmers or some areas will find opportunity in niche crops or niche products, outputs, or what have you. It's not going to be for everybody because by definition, niche is small and therefore not going to be broad acre or widespread. But, some people will be able to find good opportunities from unusual production. So, once you've got the supply chain in place, you've got to make sure that there's a buyer and a consumer at the end of the supply chain. Double check the economics and the risks as well of entering something new. Understand what you're putting yourself into, and potentially as well get out clauses if you need that. But certainly it's a huge opportunity for some people. And then the non-food, I think you touched on sort of non-farming as well, diversification. Well, that's something which has been growing gradually across all sectors of agriculture for several years now. Slowly, but it's gradually becoming a more important part of the rural business, the farm as it's known. But it's more than just producing food now. And I guess with the removal of the basic payment scheme and the increasing pressure to make profits from the resources on the farm, that is an area where a lot of people are going to be spending more time thinking about, okay, I have these resources. How can I make a good profit by deploying them differently? And that might mean non-farm. It might be some activities for the local community. It might be a farm shop, all sorts of different ideas.
Some positive news then, and some opportunities among the challenges, Graham.
Yes, indeed. I mean, there's always challenges, and the challenges get bigger. And I understand it is exceptionally difficult to farm in the current environment, but there are opportunities. If you look around for them, they might be in a slightly different place to where we've looked in previous years. But it's important to find them and capitalise from them as best as we can.
Graham Redman, farm business consultant with Andersons and editor of the John Nix Farm Management Pocketbook. Some cause for optimism among the challenges faced by farming.
The Farmers Weekly Podcast.
You're listening to the Farmers Weekly Podcast with a look at what 2025 could bring for farmers. We've heard about Defra Secretary Steve Reed's much anticipated speech to this month's Oxford Farming Conference. We've heard about farm policy and the prospects for profitable food production. But the environment too is an increasingly important source of farm income, especially in England with the Sustainable Farming Incentive. Joining us now is Tim Isaac from Ceres Rural, one of the farm business consultancies offering farmers free advice from Defra's Future Farming Resilience Fund. Tim, the Sustainable Farming Incentive, or SFI, worth looking at for farmers keen to get some cash into their business?
So SFI is pretty straightforward compared to a lot of the other options. It's there, it's available, it's becoming increasingly known. I appreciate there's been a number of iterations over the last few years, but I think we're all getting our head around it now. There are, I understand, about 30,000 plus live agreements. So there's obviously been a fairly good uptake. It's a rolling application window. You can have multiple agreements per SBI, and the cash comes in quarterly in arrears. So it's a pretty good option for getting cash into the business. There are a multitude of actions available, so you can review what's available and make sure you get the best fit with your business. And I just think, for me, it's one of those things that I would be looking to do if I haven't done already, but part of a wider plan to make sure it, dovetails with the business and fits with what I'm trying to achieve more widely. But yeah, absolutely, SFI is there. It's one of the ones that we can nail stuff onto and start getting some cash into the business.
And that's going to be particularly useful with the continued decline and the more rapid decline of the basic payment scheme.
Yes, absolutely. That was a little bit of a shock, I think, to all of us. We'd kind of got our heads around that it was reducing, and we understood that, and we were making plans accordingly. But obviously, the big reduction that was announced, towards the end of the year, does put a big pressure on cash flows, and we can't ignore that. But there are things that we can do to mitigate that, and the SFI is definitely one of them. And I think, for those who may not have gone down this route yet, it's not something to get too worried about. There are a range of actions, and some of them are relatively easy to implement, and can bring other benefits as well. So it's not something to be scared of. It's pretty straightforward, and I would urge anyone that hasn't yet done it to get an application in.
And one or two of those easy actions, Tim?
Yeah, I think, well, I mean, the overarching sort of management one, certainly from an arable perspective, would be, things like the soil testing, the soil analysis, things like the integrated pest management plan, nutrient management plan. Obviously, there's the management payment itself. So that they're all pretty straightforward and an obvious thing to incorporate into any business. And then certainly some of the rotational options, again, from an arable point of view, would fit in quite nicely. And certainly based on some of the budget analysis we've done, if you're consistently getting a sort of poor performing break crop or a bit of the farm that just isn't really performing because of sort of inherent issues in the soil or drainage or whatever, then there are certain SFI options that will stack up quite favorably against a poor performing break crop. Just be wary that some of those obviously have that 25% cap of the farmed area, but you can work those in quite nicely. So yeah, SFI for me is one that I would definitely be doing. I think it's easy and understandable to get sort of distracted by all of the noise and a lot of the things that we can't change, and that can sort of fuel that uneasy feeling of being out of control. And I think it's important in any business, but to focus on the things you can control. And if other things come along and happen in the future, well, that's a bonus. But I think, focus on the things you can control. And I would definitely include SFI as one of my controllables. There are things that I would include under the uncontrollable heading, and you sort of put those to one side, I think.
And moving on to capital grants, this postponement of capital grant payments or the processing of applications, where are we with that, and how do you see it being resolved?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. It is frustrating, but I think just coming back to my previous point, that's where I would categorise that current situation as an uncontrollable. There's nothing as an individual farmer we can do about that. We're told that it's due to the a huge increase in demand over the last 12 months. They've put it on temporary hold, subject to a review. If there's an application in the system, then it's sort of it's on hold, and we'll be contacted early in 25 with what's going to happen next. I don't know, and I'm not sure anyone knows exactly how that's going to pan out. We just have to wait for that information, which will hopefully come as early in the new year as possible. And you'd like to think that calculations based on the current financial year would start yielding some sort of results as to what may or may not be available. But as I say, there is nothing we can do about it. It is frustrating, but I think rather than sort of getting lost in that frustration, let's just park capital grants and wait, and hopefully we'll get some good news at some point. And let's just keep focusing on the things that we can influence.
And other sources of environmental revenue, I guess, things like private money for public goods, things like biodiversity net gain.
Yeah, absolutely. There are, there's a myriad of potential options out there, and some of them are quite location specific. Some of them will be suitable for some businesses and not others. I think it's important to, look what's right for your business and get the right advice in helping you to do that. My overriding advice would be to focus on getting cash into the business rather than things that may or may not happen in the future. But yeah, there are other examples available in addition to things like SFI. Those that are in countryside stewardship, higher tier or high level stewardship agreements should be being offered a mirror agreement or an extension shortly. There's some woodland schemes available, and if they qualify under the Woodland Carbon Code, there's obviously opportunities there. In terms of private money for public goods, the various water companies are offering various schemes and options available, but obviously you need to be in contact with them. There's landscape enterprise networks. They're available in Yorkshire and the east of England at the moment, and they have various rounds available for funding. And there are also premiums available. There are certain buyers, merchants, processors who are looking for food produced on regenerative principles that are prepared to offer a premium. So, there are a number of good options out there, but it's got to be right for the business. And you've got to do the research. I think one of the things I would also say is networking is becoming increasingly important. Get to know your local wildlife groups, the river trust, the water companies, the local authorities. A local farm cluster group, for example, is a great place to start, and that should ensure you get that sort of inside track on any opportunities that may arise.
So there are opportunities there for additional cash into the business, even if they're a little bit different to what we're used to.
Yeah, exactly that. And I think it's just, exactly that. It's a case of sort of stepping back and saying, okay, things are different, and not sort of looking back to the past as to, that's what worked for the business previously. We've got to change. We've got to adapt. Farming always does that, and it's very good at doing that. And I'm not for a minute saying it's not easy. It's a difficult thing to do, and it's requires some interesting conversations at family and business level. But yes, absolutely, there are options out there. But as I said, for me, it's don't get drawn into worrying about the things you can't control. The capital grant situation, we're just going to have to wait. Landscape recovery, we're waiting to hear if there's another round. Things like BNG, yes, it's there. It's very location specific. It could be valuable, but the demand to date has been lower than originally expected, and it takes time. So it's not something you can sort of rely on or base a business plan around. It's important that you base it on the things that you can influence and control, and it's a case of getting out there and attending some of these groups and getting involved with some of these clusters, because there are funds out there, but it requires a bit of proactivity and a bit of management time commitment to doing it and finding them, rather than just hoping that something might arrive.
Tim Isaac from Ceres Rural, one of the farm business consultancies offering free advice to farmers under Defra's Farming Resilience Fund scheme. We'll put a link to that scheme, to that fund, in the show notes page of this episode of the Farmers Weekly podcast, the first episode of the Farmers Weekly podcast of 2025. A reminder, though, that scheme, that Farming Resilience Fund, is due to close in March. So you've got about 3 months or so, 2 or 3 months, to get your ducks in a row and apply for advice under that scheme if you meet the criteria. As I say, that's about it from me. We will be at the Oxford Farming Conference on the 8th, 9th and 10th of January, and look forward to seeing you there. If you're going to be there and you see us, you spot us walking around with a microphone, do come and say hello. But for now, until next week, do please subscribe to the Farmers Weekly podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and if you really like what you hear, do please leave us a 5-star review. Until next week, though, I'm Johann Tasker. Thank you for listening.